So, Kylie, I'll check on it. The In the meantime, the Ed Puzzle assignment, you were looking at Scalia. Scalia was the man. There were people who reversed Scalia and Ginsburg in their views. We need to talk about that right now. And what that is, uh, when you read the Constitution. So all these issues come up, and most of the stuff we're going to talk about has been the last 100 years. The 1800s were really absorbed by slavery, and the people owning other people and the issues on that. And we were agrarian, we were farming. We didn't have the businesses, and the social issues don't start showing up. The business issues don't start showing up until about 1900, a little earlier. And then the social issues only really in the last, I don't know, 70 years. So a lot of the stuff we're talking about are pretty recent, as far as getting to the court. So when I say the court, I'm talking the Supreme Court, which you can also call SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS. POTUS is the president of the United States. FLOTUS, First Lady. GOP is the Republicans. So SCOTUS, or the court, is the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, so we have the Bill of Rights, we have the Constitution, and people sue. And they sue saying that, or people or organizations, groups sue, businesses sue, and they say, this is a violation of my rights. And so what happens is, okay, we're looking at the Constitution. Do you have that right? Is the Constitution apply here? And there are two, in order to, I'm simplifying it, you can need to go to law school, or at least a U.S. history of SCOTUS, to get a better understanding. I'm bringing it down to 5 minutes, but I'm going to simplify it into two schools, two camps. Do keep in mind the people in these camps can move a little bit, on key issues. So it's not pure; they're not robots. But there's two schools. And Scalia, who is deceased, is a living legend, or no, not a living legend. He is a legend in one school of thought. And Ruth Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, is a living legend, and she's now deceased as well, for the other school of thought. And these two camps are the fight of who's on that court and who's on any of the federal courts. And these two camps, to oversimplify it, are: how do you read the Constitution? Do you read it based on what the men of the time, when the Constitution was ratified, saw it? So when you look at cruel and unusual punishment, that's the 11th Amendment, excuse me, the 8th Amendment. The 8th Amendment says no cruel and unusual punishment. Well, what does that mean? What is cruel and unusual? What the men at that time of ratification, not just the writers, but the people fighting over ratification, saw it as, they had back then tarring and feathering. They've actually people would be grabbed by the mob and tar and feather, literally tar thrown on them and then feathers. That's pretty rough. I think you get in trouble for that now, but they've changed. Our views on what cruel and unusual have changed. The originalists, the originalism people, would say, well, we got to base what the Constitution says about cruel and unusual based on the men 200 some years ago. And they did not see the death penalty as cruel and unusual. So it's not. You don't have a constitutional right, to not have the death penalty, invoked on you. It's not cruel and unusual. The However, as Scalia says in the video, that doesn't mean you have to have a law for for death penalty. We have the death penalty is allowed under the Constitution, but Michigan, the state of Michigan, does not have the death penalty. So it doesn't mean a law can't be made protecting a right, or different than this. It's just the bare minimum. It's just what the Constitution says. Bare minimum being the bare rights that you can have. You can always have more. And I'll say that again later. The living Constitution people would say, we can't read it. We can't read it based on what other people 200 years ago, because time has changed. And we need to read it based on now. So an issue like same-sex marriage or same-sex relationship, that wasn't an issue back then. It happened. People were gay back then, but they didn't. It was against the law, and no one really pursued that it should be illegal. Should be legal. So it wasn't really talked about as an issue, let alone same sex, marriage. It just wasn't. So, but it is now. And because of the how we see the world now, that's how we should see the Constitution. Does that make sense? I would like a show of hands, hand raised, if you get what I'm saying, if it makes sense. This argument. Thank you. I got one hand. I want to see hands. It shows me you're here too. Thank you, Kate. Makes sense. Thank you, Riley. Nice seeing your face. Thanks, Jacob. You're always welcome to join us visually too. Makes sense, Joey, Kate. Thank you. Anybody have any questions on it? If you're not raising your hand, I can't answer them if I don't know what they are. You can go ahead and unraise your hand then. Maddie, that's fine. If your camera doesn't work, you can also raise your hand on. It's up there somewhere. Someone will tell. I think it's in the participants area. You can raise your hand. Now go ahead and unraise your hand. You're fine. If you, oh Jacob, I got it. I see what you wrote. We're all good. So moving on. We're all in the same spot. How are we going to read the Constitution? Okay. Keep in mind, and feel free to interrupt me if you need to, want to, with a question or thought. Keep in mind, most everything that gets to the Supreme Court is law. It's an interpretation of law. And as Scalia says in the video, you can always change the law. Of course, the liberals, the living Constitution, people would say, you don't get to make, if it's a right, you don't get to make a law, and this should be a right. So there's a lot of, there's a complexity there. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Bill of Rights. And so today I'm going to talk about the religion one, or creating it, and then the religion part of it, which is always fun, talking religion. And then we'll talk press Friday and speech, and talk about what your real rights are with speech. And if you hear about people yelling, if you get on media, social media, and they get mad at Twitter for knocking people off, and whether or not you have a right to be on Twitter. Spoiler alert, you do not have a right to be on Twitter. They can kick you off. We're going to talk about all of that, and we're going to look at media through Friday through next week. And I'm going to put press and speech together because social media is our new reality of life, and your job will be to be savvy when you're on social media. So, starting with the Bill of Rights. What is the Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Remember back from Unit 1 that there was a whole fight over the ratification of the Constitution and whether or not it should be ratified. One of the arguments against it is it didn't have a Bill of Rights. And some of the people, not all of them, but some of the Anti-Federalists were kind of into a conspiracy theory here. Conspiracy theories are nothing new. There were people convinced that the reason there wasn't a Bill of Rights is on purpose because tyranny was going to happen. That they were going to make this national government, and then they were going to be tyrannical, and they were going to abuse power. And the reason the Bill of Rights wasn't in there was because that was their way to get to violating people's rights and abusing power. So there was some conspiracy there. James Madison, who I do not believe that, and there's no indication why he would or that he did, said we just didn't because they were delegated powers. We had already restricted the national government through Article 1, Section 8. So we didn't need a Bill of Rights. And they, of course, the Anti-Federalists were not convinced. So there was a compromise on ratification that they would add a Bill of Rights. And that Bill of Rights was added after the 10 amendments. After the ratification as the first 10 amendments. So to know, if you're following along with my slides, how do you add an amendment? There are 27 constitutional amendments. All 26 of the 27 were ratified the way that is on these slides. Two-thirds approval, Senate and House. Three-fourths, when someone did the math last hour, I think it's 37 states, state legislatures. That's Lansing, and Lansing's been in the news. You can people hopefully are seeing that we have a state government, not just national. The state legislature would have to ratify it. Note that what is not included is the president. The president signs law. He does not sign amendments. Amendments are ratified or approved by states. For those who like trivia, the one exception was the end of prohibition. It went through the House and Senate, two-thirds, but then it went through state conventions. The writers of the amendment were concerned that the state legislatures wouldn't pass it to end prohibition, not to start it, to end it. So they went through state conventions, not through state legislatures. I'm not testing you on that. That's just trivia. Another piece of trivia is 12 amendments on the Bill of Rights. 12 were actually passed through the Senate and the House, but only 10 were ratified. As you know, Bill of Rights is 10. The 11th one is actually the 27th Amendment. The 27th Amendment is part of the original Bill of Rights. Following me? There's some trivia there. The other one, the 12th one, I don't remember what it is, but I remember I look it up all the time and then I forget it. It's irrelevant. Whatever it was something that we don't really have to worry about. Feel free to Google them. It'll show up. Two amendments not ratified. Or one at this point. Okay, so they amended right away by adding 10. There you go, 10 amendments. Bill of Rights. I want to note, next slide. Add the Bill of Rights. The next slide here. What exactly does the Bill of Rights do? So when we say the Bill of Rights, it protects people from the government. Fear of tyranny and abuse of the government. It does not protect you from your family, from your boss. It doesn't mean McDonald's can't kick you out. It doesn't mean that you have these rights when you're online. It's the government. Can the government either allow a lawsuit or which will be defamation, which we'll talk about, or can the government allow the lawsuit to happen, or can the government send police? Can you get a fine? Can the government be involved? That's the Bill of Rights. And keep that in mind, because a lot of people love to scream my freedom of speech, but your freedom of speech doesn't mean I can't tell you, although I am government, that you're not allowed to swear in my class. Doesn't usually bother me too much though. So who is the government? The government obviously are laws created by Congress, actions of the president, law created by Lansing, actions of the governor. One of the lawsuits against Governor Whitmer by the restaurants is arguing that she's violating the U.S. Constitution. I would actually say you don't really have to go to the U.S. Constitution. You might be able to find your rights in the Michigan one, and I'll show you that in a minute. That one, I believe, was thrown out. Just because you sue, just because you file something, doesn't mean you're going to get anywhere with it. Lots of lawsuits, and it shows up on the media. Oh, someone's suing McDonald's or Oreos. There was one a few years ago, Oreos, because they're making them overweight. Just because a lawsuit is filed doesn't mean it's going to go anywhere. Someone just is now suing Newsmax or one of these conservative news organizations for defamation. Yeah, you can sue them, but you're not probably going to win that. So bear that in mind. But this is the government. So Lansing, Washington, courts, local governments, Fruitport Township. The two that we'll probably spend more time on, well, I don't know if that's true, but it's public schools and police officers. Public schools are government. We're providing a government service with government taxes, and therefore you have some rights in the school for speech and religion. That's not the case at a private school. Private schools are not operated by government, right? They are not so they're a different situation. So we're in this really weird limbo. Public schools are. You don't have as much rights in public school as you do on the street, so to speak, but you do have some, and we'll talk about that. The other one to keep in mind, because it's been in the news quite a bit in the last year, is officers. Police officers are human beings. The actual individuals are people, and they have their fears, and they have their families, and they have their goals, and they have their values, and they're individuals. But when they put on that uniform, they are operating as a government official. And this is where people so a government official falls under the Bill of Rights. And I would argue, actually, the majority of the Bill of Rights applies to people accused of crimes. Actually, I don't even want to argue that. That's actually true if you look at it. So, policing is a key component of the majority of the Bill of Rights because they are the first person or people you're going to come in contact when it comes to the law. Often, when it comes and the law is government, and the government is you're protected from the Bill of Rights. Okay, so we're not talking about police officers as individual people with individual needs and values. We're talking about them as a unit with a uniform on, representing government. The questions or thoughts? Any? Are we good? I do. The next thing I want to know, the next, I hate the word, I don't like the word thing. Let's say the next point I want to make is everyone looking at my screen? If you're not looking at my screen, could you go ahead and Google Michigan Constitution? But if you're looking at my screen, if you Google Michigan Constitution, I want you to note, because so that you know this, that Michigan has a constitution. Every state does. And their Bill of Rights is actually at the beginning. That's why they were shady. That's why they thought the national government was being shady, because all the original colony or original states had a Bill of Rights right at the beginning to protect you from the state government. Okay, so you have a Bill of Rights, and if you click on it, or if you're watching me, my screen, here's a list. The state gives us more rights than um, than the US Constitution does. Okay. You can always give more rights at the state level. Never forget that. When people are upset that they strike something down at the US Constitution, doesn't mean that you don't have that right to state. So I like to point out this bearing of arms, Article 1, Section 6. Every person has a right to keep and bear arms for the defense of himself and the state. So, and I hope maybe that means herself as well. I don't know what age group, 18 is usually the magic age that we've decided, because I hope you would all agree 5-year-olds should not be running around with guns. And maybe you used a gun with your parents when you were 5, but should not own a gun. And if you think 5-year-olds should, what about 2-year-olds? They have to pick an age, and the age for a lot of this stuff is 18. That's the magical age where a lot of these things come into play. You're an adult, although there are exceptions. So I do want to know, when everyone talks about the Second Amendment, if you're in Michigan, you have a personal right to arms for defense. Now, everything else is law. Open carry, concealed weapons permit, all of that is law. That's not in the Michigan or the US Constitution. So they could make laws to restrict. And there are states that have way more restrictions than us, and there are states that have less. And that's all by law, state by state. This is, I'm just pointing out, the Michigan Constitution. In the right to personal ownership. That tends to be the argument under the US, is, do you have a personal right? 2 court cases have said you have a right to a handgun and, I believe, rifle shotgun. They have not ruled on semi-automatics or anything like that. That doesn't mean you don't have a right. You have one by law, but I don't know about by constitution. It's gray area. I want to note the marriage one here. We've got a marriage one. This one was struck down. Union of one man and one woman we had in our what marriage was. When the Supreme Court ruled you couldn't do this. You couldn't deny. It was a 5-4 decision. The conservatives were against it, but the majority went with the 5-4 went with the liberal living constitution view of it, that you can't deny a man a right to marry another man if a man can marry a woman. And that struck this, because the Michigan Constitution cannot violate the U.S. Constitution. That's the supremacy clause, which we talked about in Unit 1. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff here that's way more specific than what the U.S. Constitution says. Questions? So note that we do, and again, we can give you more rights. The state of Michigan can give you more rights. We can always make laws. So let's talk about the First Amendment. There are 5 components: religion, speech, press, assembly, petition the government for redress. You should get in the mood, because when people like to judge you for not knowing the Constitution, the first thing random people ask you on the street, hopefully that doesn't happen to you, is what are the 5 rights? You should be able to list these off. You should be able to spit them out. I would like you to be able to do more than that and actually know what they mean. Starting with, look at petition versus speech. Speech is your right to talk about the government. Petition the government for redress is your right to talk to the government. So your right to go and complain to the government, to show up to board meetings, to show up to local town hall meetings, to show up to Congress, to write letters. Petition the government for redress is talking to the government, telling them, complaining to them about them. Speech is your right to complain about the government. The religion, and then press. In assembly. Assembly, we've already talked about, because those were interest groups. You have a right to create an interest group. You have a right to create a group that advocates for something in the government. You have a right to assemble. It does say, though, in the actual wording of the Bill of Rights, in the First Amendment, peacefully assemble. It does say that. The actual text is in there. And this is the First Amendment, if you're looking at my slide, and I've highlighted all 5. So what we're going to talk about first is the religion one, the religion component. In the religion part, there are 2. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Okay? So first, we're going to talk about free exercise. And this will probably be the end of this class today. We'll talk about free exercise, or I'll talk about it, and hopefully you're listening. And then we'll talk about establishment on Friday. Okay, you have a right, free exercise. You have a right to practice your religion, as long as it doesn't violate the law. For example, and if you want to Google these examples, feel free to while you're sitting there. It engages your mind, keeps you awake. There was a woman who a few years ago, I don't remember where, she was being prosecuted for abusing her kids. I don't remember the details of it, but I remember her defense. Her defense was, my religion requires it. This is part of my religion to physically abuse my children. Yeah, that didn't fly. You don't get to abuse your children. There's a lot of controversies on what is spanking and what is abusing, and that's in psychology. We can talk about that. But in the U.S., my sister will tell you, she works CPS, that leaving a mark. Leaving a mark is the abuse threshold for the government. Doesn't mean it's not an abuse threshold for you personally, but for the government, it's leaving a mark for physical abuse. You can't do that, and you can't argue. Well, you can do it, but if you are prosecuted, you can't use religion. So here's an example I'm going to give you. You can't marry more than one person. You can't sacrifice human beings and call it your religion. They're going to say, nice try, murder. But there are some, we do know through court cases. So, like, how do we know that you can't abuse your kids and call it religion? Because someone tried to use that defense and it did not work. So some people were prosecuted. You can look this up. I don't remember the state. They were prosecuted for abusing animals because in their voodoo practice, they were slicing the necks of chickens and killing them and draining the blood. And so they were accused and I assume convicted uh, of animal abuse. That made it to the Supreme Court. That because they were saying we have a right to do this. Do you think they won their case? Raise your hand if you believe that you have a constitutional free exercise right to kill an animal. Now, we're not talking about abusing an animal, we're talking about killing an animal, slicing its throat for I got 3. I got a sure from Joey. 3. Yeah, if you're hopefully you're listening, thank you for saying. Yeah, because we kill animals, right, to eat them. Right. You can actually do I don't know if they ate the chickens. You'd have to look it up. They might not have. But because Americans kill chickens to eat them, you can't call it abuse when they're killing the chicken for religion. I don't know what would happen if they were dogs. We look at dogs as pets. I don't know how that would. Well, yes, Joey, that's different on rabies. But I mean, like if you are rounding up dogs and killing them in the name of your religion. I know people kill dogs. All I know is no one does it. the Thanks, Kylie, for uh the point being is this is where someone brought it to the court and the court made a decision. This is not abuse. This is not animal abuse. Now, if it had been some other way of treating the animal, although there have been examples where cases have been ruled freedom of speech on animal abuse because the law was too vague. Follow me here? And if a law is too vague, like one law about animal abuse that said you can't videotape it, that law was so vague it would apply to deer hunters posting or videotaping and posting deer hunt and killing a deer. And that is something perfectly, our society finds perfectly reasonable to do. So that the law was struck down as being too vague, even though the videos they were actually going after were pretty grotesque. They were arguably animal abuse. Things get really, but it's hard. And that's what the cases are for. So, free exercise. Uh, what gets tricky with free exercise is what if society and individuals disagree? So, excuse me, I'm sighing just to sigh. The In Michigan, we have a federal law and we have state laws that protect people based on their race, religion, national origin, gender, but we do not have a law that says you can't discriminate against two men or two women who want to get married. So, for example, if you have a wedding venue and a man wants to marry a woman and one's black, one's white, you could probably get sued or and get in trouble per the law. I don't know the law well enough. That's what law school is for. You could probably though get in trouble legally because in our country, if you want to have a wedding venue or you want to practice wedding stuff, if you want that kind of business, you can't discriminate based on race, even if it's your religious argument. Um, Obviously, you can be based on religion. Catholics don't marry, people that are not members of their church, etc., things like that. What gets a little hazier is in Colorado, they actually have a law that you can't discriminate against same sex marriages, that you have to make the cake. You have to, if you want to make wedding cakes, you make wedding cakes for all people who can get married. Otherwise, you don't be in the wedding cake business. That would be their argument. Now they have all these procedures for exceptions and stuff, and if you look into the law and you want to see that, look into the law because you can go to a panel of people and they can analyze whether or not you're an exception XYZ and I again go to a lawyer, seek a lawyer if you want the details or look it up, Google it. Anyway, we don't have that law, but Colorado does. So then the question becomes Well, but this is my free exercise of my religion, and I don't believe personally in same-sex marriage. This is what a guy did. This was a lawsuit, right? This was a case that made it Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually punted the decision. They didn't actually make a real decision, so both sides claimed victory on that decision. We're waiting again for a new one. Just like I don't know if you're watching the news, the Supreme Court, this goes in line, same idea. There's a school, and if you're watching my screen, I'll show you the case. There was a school, and I don't know what state it is, that is allowing, if you are transgender and you identify as a female, you use the female bathroom. And same with transgender male. Oh, it's Oregon. There we go. Oregon. Oh, that makes sense. So they were sued by an interest group who says that's violating the law, their Title IX law rights. Hopefully you're following me. They're not suing under the Constitution at this point. They're suing under Title IX law. The the court chose not to hear the case. So it is allowed, and it is not, no one is, they're not. That doesn't mean they won't take a case in the future. Sometimes they take cases because they have to. It's kind of, they're put in a bind. Sometimes they're looking for the right case. So as it stands right now, we could arguably do this too as a rule, and see what happens. But Michigan does not protect LGBTQ by law the way that some states do. But there is this law, Title IX, which is a federal law that says you can't discriminate based on sex. And transgender argues that discriminating against gender is a sex discrimination against um, gender. Oh, I hope some of you are following me because this stuff really is, to me, interesting. Um, so it gets, we'll see what happens. For those of you who are interested, either because you are against LGBTQ rights or you are for LGBTQ rights, Michigan has a petition drive right now. There are people in Michigan, an interest group, to get that protection on into Michigan law or constitution. I'm not sure which one, for LGBTQ. So there is a goal to get it as a proposal for people to vote on in 2022. So be on the lookout for that. Because the legislature is not interested in that law. Some states, the legislature might, but the people might be. So we'll see. You might vote on that, just like people voted on marijuana a few years ago. Questions or thoughts? Anybody have any thoughts on this? Anybody want clarification?
Wait, so you can have like so like for like that cake bakery
Yeah.
example, that can be well like so if someone runs a shop or whatever and then like they don't want to make the cake, do they have to because
Not
they because like they have freedom of religion and it's in their religion not to do that, or they have to do it because it's law?
in Michigan, they don't have to because there's no law.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who want to make it law and say that,
Oh,
okay, they want to make, and it's a protection. Another example would be housing. Like if you want to rent a room. What's really weird about housing though is that it's against the law for a man and a woman to live together who are not married or relatives in Michigan. I don't know if you know that. I might have said it before. It is against the law. So arguably, it's actually, the law discriminates against a man and a woman relationship, but there's no law that says two women can't live together. But let's say you are renting